Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such
Hello again.
and Neil Almond.
Hello again, good to be back.
It's good to see you again, guys. This time, we're going to explore the quote-unquote phonics of maths. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
In the past couple of days, I was introduced to a blog by Mark Seidenberg. Those who are interested in reading will know the name Mark Seidenberg from his brilliant book, Language at the Speed of Sight, which I believe was recommended to me by Neil about 6 years ago on Twitter before we really knew each other. And this blog is called On the Phonemes in Phonemic Awareness. And it's a really interesting blog. Lots of stuff I agree with. The basic idea he's trying to put across is that there are misconceptions about what phonemes are that are held by teachers. And partly in this blog and in other things that I've seen him write and say are some bits and pieces that I'd like to push back on a tiny bit. Because while he's absolutely right that teachers often do hold misconceptions around phonemes. Often we simplify what they are in order to help us kind of understand the basics of phonics. What he does next with that, or the argument he seems to go with following on from that, is this idea that, well, we shouldn't minimize the schwa sound after consonants. Now, it sounds very niche. Anyone who teaches phonics will know that generally the advice that we receive is that if you're segmenting a word like bat, you should try and say b-at, minimizing the schwa sound after the consonants. Now, he says, well, there's lots of teachers who say this is the correct way to pronounce phonemes. If you understand what phonemes are, there is no correct way to pronounce it. And as a result, I think I've seen lots of teachers then say, oh, we shouldn't be doing this minimizing. If there's no correct way to pronounce phonemes, we shouldn't be doing this minimizing. But that's to mistake the theory behind phonemes and productive things that we do in the classroom. The short answer being that research into how we should pronounce, in inverted commas, phonemes is basically non-existent. And those of us who have spent a lot of time teaching reading have often found that actually minimizing these consonant sounds, schwa after consonant sounds, is actually really useful for teaching blending and segmenting. It's a very long-winded way to say that, as well as educators listening to researchers, sometimes I think it might be valuable for the reverse to happen as well. Anyway, that niche subject aside, Neil, what are you reading for?
So I'm reading a chapter within sort of a larger piece of work called Reaching and Understanding Innovations in How We View Reading Assessment. It's quite an old book now. I think it was published maybe 2011, 2012. But I was particularly wanted it because I had to find a chapter called Multiple Bases for Comprehension Difficulties, the Potential of Cognitive and Neurobiological Profiling for Validations of Subtypes and Developments of Assessments. But the interesting part of that is that it's written by Hollis Scarborough of Scarborough's famous reading rope, and a big sort of criticism that many people have with that reading rope model is that it kind of leaves out a lot of the strategic elements of reading and that kind of executive function aspect. And I was told, I think I possibly read it in a Shanahan blog about basically how Scarborough, yes, in I think the reading rope was 2011-ish. This came just afterwards, how Scarborough was fully aware of that importance of that role of executive function, of that kind of verbal memory, reasoning, planning and organizing. And she actually has another little diagram in this, which includes a lot of the components of the reading rope, but with the addition of these sort of executive functions as well. So I was just kind of quite interesting to see where, that comes from because she's familiar, she's famous for the reading rope. This seems to be some sort of, although it's not in a diagram as pretty as the reading rope, it is, she has conceptualized this slightly differently, including the role of executive function that plays within reading itself. So yeah, quite an interesting little read. Quite a lot that I think I'm learning from it in terms of that kind of executive function. And yeah, I'm glad. It sounds really niche, but I'm glad I hunted it down and found it.
Just to jump in there, I think one of the things about the reading rope that people often don't realise is that it was created off the back of Hollis Scarborough doing research into what is kind of predictive of long-term reading attainment. So one of the reasons potentially why things like metacognition aren't in there is because at the time, well, metacognition even now is an executive function is quite a difficult thing to pin down. You can pin down bits of working memory and this and other aspects linked to executive function, but it's quite difficult to have a bit of research that says yes, we've looked at this bit of we've looked at executive function and we can see that there are definite implications for long-term reading attainment, or at least it was at the time. And just also, it was first produced in 1992 for parents and then first published in 2001. So it's a lot older than people realise, and also created completely separately from the simple view of reading and from it with a different methodology. So although there's kind of links between the two, it's interesting to find that they're the creation of it was completely disconnected.
What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
Fantastic. Did you guys coordinate your we're just going to go for these giants of the reading game? Because I haven't got one. And actually, until today, I thought the schwa sound was a sound, like in Pashwari or in Schwarzenegger. And I was wondering, we don't really have that many words with the schwa sound. Why is it so important?
Well, I mean, you could make an argument. If someone says a schwa sound, schwa is a sound. It depends whether we're using schwa as a label or as a little chunk of sound. So you're not technically wrong. Depends how you're spelling it.
And with Schwarzenegger, it's you had to go full Austrian accent, I think. So yeah, maybe misguided. So I've been reading a review from University of Nottingham. I can't remember if I've recommended this before or not, but it's really, really interesting. It's called Local Learning Landscapes, Exploring Coherence, Equity and Quality in Teacher Professional Development in England. And it's from a team up there. And the two people who I've spoken to about it were Toby Graney and Catherine Gripton. And essentially it looks at the interplay between the different bodies that we have trying to support schools and teachers in their maths CPD, and sort of relays people's experiences and also what the landscape sort of looks like. And it's really, really interesting because obviously we've got, over the last 10 years, we've sort of separated out into having not only local authorities exploring CPD, but multi-academy trusts and universities. And so, they've got some really nice diagrams, which I think they're going to make the sort of the format available so that everyone can make up it, should they have pertinent data. And it just sort of shows you, say, in different, in a city, in a town, in the sort of more, I think they call it the Shire, more countryside parts, how those sort of bodies relate to each other and what teacher CPD looks like. So it's really interesting, particularly if anyone's interested in sort of wider CPD and what that should look like. And because I think it doesn't give you any answers, but it leads towards, here are the things we should be focusing our attention on over the next 10 years, I think. Today's episode, quote unquote, Phonics of Maths, it's inspired by, I think I read this around about 10th of October 2023 in the global news organization that delivers fearless investigative journalism, giving a voice to the powerless and holding power to account, The Guardian. And it said, Labour announces Phonics for Maths scheme in planned curriculum review. And the Shadow at the time, Education Secretary, said, maths is the language of the universe. That's why I'm proud to tell you today that we'll be tackling our chronic cultural problem with maths by making sure it's better taught at 6, never mind 16. Take that, Rishi, who had obviously very close to that time announced a new MPQ just so he had something to announce and all the work that entails. So we've essentially, I thought, well, actually, now there's a likelihood that this might be on the agenda. So it's probably worth discussing what this looks like and what this might mean for schools or what it could potentially mean for pupils. So I don't know, Chris, you're going to take the reins on this one because you're giving me the. I don't really have much to say, but I'm sure we'll find that you do have plenty to say as we go through the episode.
I think it's more that I just won't have as much to say of value as you will. So I think it makes more sense for me to host and to ask you and Neil the questions. And the first of which, I guess, is what do you think people are talking about when they talk about phonics for maths? I know it's something that Shadow Education Secretary had talked about, but it's also a phrase that's been floating around Edu Twitter for all of the time I've been there. So, what do you think is meant by it?
I think this is an important question because I think the answers to the rest of the questions that might be asked about this change depending on what we mean. Because I think the natural inclination is to think about key facts, because obviously we've got key signs. We learn those signs, we blend those signs, and then our reading journey sort of is enhanced from there. But listening to what Bridget Phillipson had to say at the time and thinking about early mathematics in general, I think the phonics of maths should be those elements of mathematics which allow for success in the subject. So spatial reasoning, key facts definitely, and then pattern spotting. Because I think if you were to sum up development matters into three sort of broad themes, and the mathematics that children engage with from birth, those are probably the three. I don't know if you want to maybe be more specific about geometry, but I think a phonics of maths potentially is the spatial reasoning, the key facts, and the pattern spotting necessary to engage with the subject in a more formal and obviously more enriching way. I don't know, Neil, would you add anything to that? Or even contest that?
Not much contesting for sure. I went down a rabbit hole as I always end up doing when we are given niche things to talk about. And kind of from what I can kind of tell, this kind of the first idea or the first sort of, actual academic that talks about this idea of phonics for maths is a chap called Daniel Asani. Ansari, potentially. I'll go and double check that. Who's a professor at, I think, Ontario University. So, Chris, you might have bumped into him at one of your famous, raucous reading conferences that you've had out there. He could have been, because from my understanding is he kind of makes this kind of phonics analogy himself by almost taking through trying to find his interpretation of what the phonics of maths is trying to find the developmental perspective on what learning maths is like, much like there needs to kind of be elements of phonemic awareness and then learning phonics and then learning some sub skills like blending, segmenting, etc., etc. His sort of position is that there must be some basic competencies that children have to have in place and able to do mathematics well, as there is for children to be able to read well. And I think a lot of his research looks at trying to find what those key foundational competencies in maths are. And as kind of Kieran has alluded to, his kind of three sort of I'm sure that's not a definitive list, but kind of three overarching umbrellas of pattern spotting, spatial awareness, and number facts. Obviously, many people listening, I'm sure, will know, within number facts, there's a lot of learning that needs to go on before we can just get to going, what's 1 + 2, what's 2 + 2, etc., etc. So I think that's kind of, going to what I think is not the source, but a source. That's sort of what is meant by this phonics for maths, trying to find those foundational competencies that really kind of pin down later success within mathematics.
I like Daniel's work. He was the one who wrote that, well, I think co-wrote 2000 paper about dyscalculia. And essentially the conclusion was we don't really know enough about this to advise anybody on how to deal with it. And I thought, I'm waiting for the follow-up. But I've always, I think, because I'm pretty sure he was based over here for a while, maybe after or during the pandemic. And so he's almost got his combination of, it's almost the Canadian education system, but he understands, I think, the English education system too. And so whenever he speaks, I tend to listen. So it's interesting he actually went to something he'd written about that.
Yeah, and you're right. It's Anne Sarney. I actually found his article. I think he was interviewed for the TES relatively recently. I think that's where I found that kind of first reference, which then led me down to various other sites and whatnot.
So it's interesting because what the two of you have described there is, obviously it doesn't entail everything that is part of early mathematics, but it's much closer to everything than I would argue, say, phonics is for reading. I mean, the central argument about phonics when it comes to reading is that understanding the stuff that we learn through phonics is necessary but not sufficient. And there's quite a clear way of saying, look, when we're teaching phonics, we're focusing on just this important thing. And we want to kind of target that, understand that, make sure that's taught well. And then there's other stuff. Whereas what you're talking about here feels a bit more like it's, in your own words, all or the vast majority of what is required for later mathematical development. Does that sound fair?
I think so. I also think it's potentially necessary because whenever I think about reading and maths, I think their constitution is slightly different and the way that the different elements interact with each other slightly different, because you're thinking about you've almost got the same ideas, but the depth or the sort of complexity. I don't want to say complexity because early maths is really complex, but it's the same idea, but it's distinguished from previous iterations of that idea because you're adding something to it. And I don't think that's when I imagine reading or phonics, it almost feels more linear because you're heading towards that. Once you've learned to read, you've learned to read, so to speak. But with the mathematics, that interplay is always really important. I don't know if that's a fair generalization, but I think it's necessary because it's not a case of here's the one thing, in as much as it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It feels like you get to a point where you've got a sufficient understanding of the subject, whereas I think with mathematics, there's always somewhere else to go. I don't know. So perhaps trying to look for a directly equitable counterpart isn't possible. So I don't know. I don't actually know if we're getting any closer to articulating exactly what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah. So I think one of the issues here is that with reading, the assumption at least is that most kids are turning up with some degree of language comprehension. And so what you really want to kickstart reading is the word recognition part of that. So you do that through decoding and there's a focus on that. And it's worth targeting that specifically while still continuing to build all the language comprehension stuff. Whereas I don't think there's that interplay between two clear elements in mathematics. I mean, I have to admit, when we suggested or this conversation, this discussion, in the back of my mind, if someone had said to me, go on, Chris, what do you think phonics of maths means? I would have said early number bond acquisition. And the bits and pieces before that, and the application of that, but I would have been saying, okay, what's the thing that I think doesn't get taught, particularly well from my experience, where there are significant issues down the line? It would have been, okay, early number bond acquisition specifically, and the precursors that lead into that. Now, that's not to say that I disagree when you're talking about pattern spotting and spatial reasoning, but in my head, I would have been thinking about those things, particularly in relation to how they support the development of early number bond acquisition. And I would have been thinking, to try and make that analogy with phonics, I would have been thinking, okay, how do we make that systematic? How do we make it step by step, clearly defined? We learn this bit and then this bit and then this bit and then this bit, and we're able to do formative assessment as we go along. Because I presume that when most people are talking about phonics for maths, they're talking about phonics the way it's done in English primary schools or primary schools more generally, where we're actually talking about systematic phonics. It's not just the teaching of this stuff, it's the idea that we have a clearly specified step-by-step approach so I personally, I would have thought of it in that way, but you've perhaps just like opened my mind to the broader possibilities that are available here.
Initially, when I first saw the headline, that's what I thought. But then the more I thought about it, the more I sort of went, well, actually, if kids aren't able to fit themselves into different spaces, and if they aren't doing those things with puzzles, are they going to be I don't know, open to testing things out later on when mathematics does become more formal? I mean, I'm more than happy for us to focus on those key facts because, I mean, we had a brief sort of aside prior to recording where we sort of, I was sort of making connections between the idea that roughly a third of, or just less than a third of pupils aren't meeting the expected standard. And for me, I think something is going wrong early on. I think the solution is, we mentioned last week about generally giving early years teachers the best opportunity to be the best they can possibly be and stuff like that there. But there are many, many year 5 and year 6 pupils who don't know their key bonds within 20, and that has a massively detrimental effect. So I think we could probably focus our attention on key bonds, because it's something quite close to my heart, the fact that all kids should know this. But I think, with the caveat that actually we do appreciate that there's a lot that happens early on that really sets pupils up for success, not least dispositionally, if we don't even think about the subject matter as well.
Yeah, and I think maybe we can talk about what this systematic, step-by-step, clearly defined approach to early number bond acquisition might look like, as well maybe as talking about what those precursors are, the breadth and variety of experiences that pupils are going to need to be able to engage with just the basic concept of number in the first place, how we get, the importance of spatial awareness for then being able to deal with the objects that you might use to learn number bonds, etc. So maybe it does make sense for us to kind of narrow it down in that sense, but with the caveat that there are elements behind this early number bond acquisition that are necessary precursors. And I guess this brings me on to a second question, which is, based on what we've said, is this an apt analogy? I think we've addressed this. Is it a productive analogy? Are there potential advantages and disadvantages, in other words, to talking about this stuff as the phonics of maths?
It's helpful in the sense that teachers now will be familiar with the concept of phonics and what it's trying to do, and understanding that it's, just a smaller part of a far larger whole in terms of we're practicing this, but the endpoint looks quite different in terms of what comprehending text is. And so I think in terms of teachers being able to make sense of what we might be talking about, I think it's an easy analogy for teachers to fall back on, and I think that will help them understand what you would be trying to do in a sort of a phonics for maths sort of situation. Phonics is trying to teach sound spelling correspondences and the various sub skills of blending, segmenting, manipulation, discrimination, whatever it is, and trying to crack that code. And reading some of Daniel's articles and work, a big thing that he kind of talks about is linking symbols to quantities, which is reading, right? It is breaking that code of, here is another abstract squiggly symbol, but it represents not only a spoken word, but also a quantity behind that as well. So, there's even more going on in terms of trying to understand what this squiggly line that we call 3, and we say 3, but 3 also represents 3 whatever, and it can be whatever. It can be 3 sheep, 3 people, 3 fingers. There is a lot going on there. So I think kind of breaking down and teachers knowing this aspect of what phonics is trying to do, getting them to think about what those things might be in mathematics, like understanding how symbols relate to quantities, like supertizing, using, quantifying, quick manipulation of, by quick manipulation of numbers, by being able to see, okay, within 4 there are 2 sets of 2, or there's a set of 1 and a set of 3. I think it's pretty useful. I think it's a useful phrase, and a useful analogy for teachers, because I think teachers understand phonics so well. It's going to really help them understand what it is that we mean by teaching them these, by understanding that actually we're not going straight to reading a text like we would do, because we know that's the wrong thing to do. So we're not going to go straight into not even solving abstract problems. We're not even going to put abstract squiggle for 2, then this weird symbol which we understand to mean add, and then another symbol, and then this other 2 lines which means equals. There's actually a lot that we need to do before that. And so I think it's a powerful analogy, because teachers understand phonics so well, why phonics is there, what phonics is trying to do, and they understand that just putting that text in front of them, i.e. word problem or abstract calculation, isn't helpful. There's a whole wealth of knowledge and understanding that the kids need to get to before they're ready for that.
It probably speaks to the fact that getting a consensus among the maths community is relatively difficult, or more difficult. And we always speak about how I'm jealous of the research into reading and the research into phonics, because it's pretty conclusive in many respects. And so I think it should be possible to identify and to give a name to this idea. And I think, as Neil rightly says, teachers are really aware of the phenomenon. And if we're thinking about aptonology, something that's raised expectations, awareness, skill. In that respect, if that's what we're looking for, and that's what I think phonics has done, or certainly the teaching of phonics and the sort of professional development that's been put in place and the expectations have been put in place over the last 14 years or so, I think in that respect it is apt. Is it possible? I think so. But, could we put a name on it right now? I don't think so. So I like the idea that we need to focus greater attention on the fundamentals, the nuts and bolts of the subject. And part of it, I think, begins with being really clear on where the transition from almost the evolutionary advantageous things that we learn about mathematics just through engagement with the world, and where that bridge actually exists. Because I talk about the bridge, and it happens somewhere between the age of 3 and 5, the mathematics that, to probably use biologically primary, biologically secondary, and that idea, I know it's not without its critics, but for me it holds that at some point in a child's journey in mathematics, things need to be taught. Whereas there are many things, like supertizing within 3, develops naturally. I'm pretty sure I read a paper recently about apes and demonstrated supertizing, and any further counting they wanted to do had to be taught, and it was the usual thousands of hours of response to stimulus, and so it's not actually counting that's happening. So I think we need to identify at what point experience is insufficient, because that'll help us to identify what the phonics actually consists of. So I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but in terms of describing the general phenomenon and what we've seen over the last decade or so, I think the analogy is apt. I think it makes sense from a political standpoint, because it shows continuity with the drive to be more, like you say, Chris, systematic, and to be more effective by focusing on those things that pupils really need to know.
There's a lot to be said for the label. I agree with everything that's been said there, pretty much. I would say, playing devil's advocate, looking at it from the other side, is that phonics is obviously not without its controversy. It is lots of people push back on it, and perhaps attaching this label to something also brings a certain amount of baggage from phonics. I don't think that necessarily outweighs the positives, as you say, of teachers having a sense of what this is all going to be about potentially. But it's there. It's a potential disadvantage. I mean, one thing that perhaps hasn't been mentioned or is implied, maybe by what you both said, is what it suggests about phonics, that people are now saying, oh, okay, what's the phonics of maths, is kind of to suggest that phonics in reading has a level of acceptance. There's a degree to which the education community are saying, you know what, this is a valuable thing. What's the equivalent of this in another subject where we appear to have similar difficulties? Perhaps the greatest advantage of it, potentially, is that when you speak to teachers about phonics, if you say to a teacher that we've got this kid in year 4, they really are still struggling with decoding, so presumably what we need is a form of phonics intervention or something that targets aspects of what they've learned in phonics, there's no controversy about that. Whereas if I speak to teachers, or I think, a couple of years back when I was still in the classroom, when I spoke to teachers about kids struggling with mathematics in, say, year 4, 5, and 6, if I said something like, oh, well, this kid is really struggling with the basics of number bonds, we need to target that, there would often be pushback that teachers would say, well, if they've not learned it by now, it's never going to take, there's not much we can do, which is contrary to my experiences of trying to teach this stuff. And so, in effect, it might allow us, in the same way that we do with phonics, to make the case for teaching this stuff to older pupils where it is still required. Okay, so the next question really, and we've started to get into this, but I would love a bit more detail, is what do we think Phonics for Maths should actually include, and what year groups potentially might we be looking at for this stuff? Is it something where we're thinking, oh, this is primarily going to be reception and key stage 1? Is there scope for it to go beyond that? What are we actually talking about in practice if we are looking at early number bond acquisition as the center of this stuff?
If we start with the key bonds, I think nursery, where they're joined to a school, reception 1, 2, and 3 are all fair game, I think, for having key bonds on the agenda. I don't know if many schools have noticed this, but I've certainly noticed that where there's an intense focus on multiplication in perhaps year 4, by the time pupils get to year 6, some of the, you're just left with the residue. Obviously, the kids who practice at home will still know their tables, but you almost have this detrimental effect where you focus so much, but actually it's almost equating to cramming. And I think to avoid that, you spread the bonds out across those 3/4 year groups, with the caveat that the multiplicative aspects of the national curriculum aren't appropriate until the additive aspects have been embedded. Because we can, because of the feature of 2, 5s, and 10s. You mentioned year 2 in England, I'm sure other curricula as well. You sort of get that. There's almost this willingness to move towards that before it's actually appropriate, because I think, like, within 10 and 210, you've got 25 unique bonds. And I'm not including that in 0 because that's a slightly different concept in my eyes. And then within 20, you've probably got that again, and then maybe 50% more. I haven't counted them recently. But essentially you've got these, let's say, 3 years worth of, if you took one a week, 3 years worth of facts, and spreading those out over 4 years, I think allows you the space to make sure you really know them, because when year 3, say, what age are they? 7 going on 8 in that year. The first time they meet multiplication and formal multiplication and some of the concepts within multiplication, if they're not ready, I mean, that journey takes a long time anyway, but if they're not ready, sometimes that's where they get off the bus. Because like I always say that if say I'm teaching it in February of year 3, that's only the first time I'm introducing them to this idea. If they still have a recollection and can use that information in July, then I'll be happy. And so I'm giving them regular opportunities to rehearse it. But and that's the default. That's if everything's going well. That's how difficult it is to get your head around some of the multiplicative reason that's necessary in lower key stage 2, and that rough age group. But if knowledge of key bonds isn't securely in place, I think you're wasting your time. And so I would caveat that, okay, we're not going near the multiplicative aspects of the national curriculum until this is embedded, until pupils can show they can confidently manipulate numbers within 20, perhaps within 100. But I would certainly say little and often, one bond a week. That's all you have to focus your attention on. And then you build up over time. And obviously things like retrieval, not necessarily a formal low stakes quiz, but some sort of retrieval for kids as they go through. So I mean, that's from a number bonds perspective. We've got to be really explicit about which bonds is we're going to teach. We need to be systematic in how we teach them. And I think we need to be realistic about which year groups we expect pupils to encounter them. Those would be my 3 key things. I'll stop short there to allow Neil a chance to maybe explore bonds, and because I've got some more thinking on the broader mathematical stuff that we mentioned as well.
Yeah, and I think I'm coming to it from that sort of broader sense in that if, let's say, by the end of year 2, which now that Key Stage 1 stats have disappeared, feels like a good point in time, we want kids to be fluent in number bonds within 20. What am I kind of looking? What are the kind of things that I'll be wanting to see teachers from reception through to that point in time, so around May of year 2? What's the kind of things that I want to see them doing, and kind of what do I think this might look like potentially in a developmental sort of way, and feel free to kind of come in at any point, anyone, for this. So I think there's something there about making sure that teachers are beginning their practice by really sort of activating that sort of innate mathematicness that we have within us. So I'd kind of, at reception, I'd be looking at, real simple, is there more whatever on this side than there is on that side, sort of getting into that kind of approximate number system that is sort of innate within children. There are studies, I remember reading one in Clemens and Samara's book about how babies can distinguish between different quantities by looking at one that has, they'll always look at, I think, something that has more when you give them 2 options, they'll just 2 or 3 dots or whatever. So I think there's that aspect of kind of that approximate number system. Building onto that, then I'd be wanting activities that build on conceptual and perceptual subitizing, and kind of really building that sort of understanding of number within that. So conceptual subitizing, can you just kind of perceptual subitizing, just show 3 whatever, 4 whatever, can you tell me how many that there were? Conceptual subitizing, a little bit more complex, because there's probably about a limit, depending on how you structure your fancy patterns, about 6, I think, if it's in that kind of classic dice array of 2 groups of 3. Anything more than that, and children tend to struggle to perceptually subitize. But conceptual subitizing is when they can see that array of 3, 2 lots of 3. Maybe there's one more, so they can see or they may not see it in as a group of 6 and a group of 1. They may see it as a group of 4 and a group of 3. But they're kind of conceptually subitizing those aspects. So plenty of activities to do that. And a good friend, the 10 frame is one of my favorite manipulatives to kind of build on that, and that kind of helps build in some of that visuospatial stuff and space that Kieran, you were talking about earlier. linked to all of these, and I should have said this before, these aren't really sort of hierarchical because you need some understanding of number and the principles of counting to be able to do some of this conceptual supertizing stuff, but definitely kind of the principles of counting, you're not going to be able to, I think, get to that point of deep knowledge of understanding what's happening at those number bonds if you can't count. Now, I totally appreciate that some of those principles of counting sort of does include the cardinality principle, so that massive cognitive threshold concept and leap that the last number that you count within a group acts as the final counting name, but also the total amount within that group, and that's such a massive thing for children to understand. So I definitely think understanding that is really important for children to be able to really understand those bonds, so that can really help them manipulate those numbers. I've coined a new phrase. You can tell me if it's accurate or not, but I'm going for the grapheme numerosity correspondence. Because grapheme phoneme doesn't quite work. I think it could be grapheme phoneme numerosity correspondence, but I'm happy to chat about whether we think that's useful or not. But that understanding of, you can represent, let's say, 3 as a word in spoken language and as its own abstract symbol as well. You definitely need them to understand that, because you want to get to a point, I think, where kids can do this using mathematical notation. Now, I think that actually might be almost the last step. I'd be very happy if in year 1 you could just ask children what's 2 and 3, and they could just tell you 5 straight away without having to write down these as abstract symbols. But you definitely want to get them there at that point. And then this idea that numbers are something that can be breakable, and that you can then sort of build them back up. So yes, we have 5, but as I mentioned earlier, we can see 5 as 1 and 4, and you can manipulate that to your heart's content, and you can do with that what you want. And therefore you can then start building things. So, and that's where kind of would lead quite nicely then into perhaps some of these mental arithmetic strategies that you might use, like decomposing certain numbers to form, I think, Chris, you call this the friendly numbers. So finding, so if you had 7 and 9, you might decompose 7 into 1 and 6, because 1 and 9 is a friendly number because it always makes 10. So I think for me, that's kind of how I kind of see that. Well, I would think the phonics of maths should include, if we're thinking about getting to that point of deep understanding of number bonds. But I'm happy to have any pushback, or if you think I've missed something, do let me know.
It will come as no surprise to anyone who is a regular listener that my thoughts on this are strongly influenced by Leaping Ma and Clements and Sarama, on the assumption that counting is being worked on, spatial awareness, all of the things that we've already discussed are part of the wider curriculum. If I were to try and simplify what I think needs to happen, I would say that first there needs to be a wide array of experiences to develop what Neil's been talking about: perceptual and conceptual supertizing. Basically, lots of guided object play, very useful for that. On the assumption that counting, spatial awareness stuff is there, and that it starts with experiences that develop perceptual and conceptual supertizing. So lots of guided object play. We're then looking at the development of number sense inside 5, and then more broadly number sense inside 10, leading to basically your addition relationships inside 10 by using doubles. So, double 1, double 2, double 3, double 4, double 5, related near doubles. So if you know double 3, then you know 3 and 4. If you know double 2, you know 2 and 3, etc. And learning that, again, visually, going back to what Neil said about 10 frames, very useful here. Basically learning about the relationships inside 10, and then once you're comfortable with them, relating that to the related subtraction facts. So, if you know that 7 and 2 is 9, you also know that 9 can be composed of 7 and 2. If I remove 7 from 9, I get 2, in other words. The next stage after that, like relationships inside 10, is then, okay, I want to now be able to deal with any single digit addition, even if it goes beyond 10. I want to be able to deal with 7 and 9, 6 and 6, which has a similar pattern. We might be looking first at doubles and then near doubles, adding a number to 10 so that we can then use bridging through 10. So knowing quite quickly that 10 and 5 is 15, which obviously builds into place value understanding, in order to be able to say, oh, okay, if I know 10 and 5 is 15, that helps me loads when I'm doing 9 and 6, and understanding why that helps. Once you've got those single digit addition facts, and this might be more kind of year 1, year 2 at this point, you're also then relating that to the related subtraction facts. From my experience, at least, getting kids really comfortable with addition facts or the relationships relating to addition is once those are in place, learning the related subtraction facts is considerably easier. And I guess the final step is, once you've got this aim achieved, once kids do know all of their single digit addition facts and the related subtraction facts, the final step is to show the incredible array of applications that has. So once you know that 7 and 5 is 12, you also know that 27 and 5 is 32, or 70 and 50 is 120, or 0.7 and 0.5 is 1.2. Basically applying your understanding of place value to this seemingly small set of addition and subtraction facts opens up a world of mental arithmetic. And just taking kids into the first steps of that probably would still count as the phonics of maths, for me at least. Anyway, sorry, that's quite a long waffle. None of those ideas are mine. Again, check out the work of Li Ping Ma if you're interested in a specific progression with that stuff and how that played out in certain Chinese schools.
Yeah, because I think what you guys have done is you've almost taken the body of knowledge that we have with regards to early mathematical development and condensed it down into what you think, or what Li Ping Ma thinks is important. And this is almost what I was going to speak about, is that the idea that this is not new knowledge. This knowledge has been around for a while. I always mess up the names of the two researchers who sort of coined the principles of counting. It's like Gestel and Gelman or something along those lines. I think that might have been 1963, the first time they mentioned that. Yet teachers regularly describe it as a light bulb moment when they hear about it for the first time in 2023, 24. So I think the vehicle for this is just as important. I don't want to go into your next question too soon, but if we think about the statutory documents we have, I think it's possible for them to be more explicit. And if we subscribe to the idea that some things are essential and some things are a luxury, being explicit about those distinctions, being more mathematical, and perhaps less open to interpretation, which phonics became for teachers. There were certainly fewer options on the table. Here's a tried and tested method of delivery. And I think if development matters could become something, I guess, because I know that the English national curriculum, no national curriculum in the world that I've read actually does this job. But I think if we want to get across how important these things are, one of the options we have is to make that early statutory document really clear in a number of ways that perhaps it isn't at the moment, because you can interpret it in a couple of different ways, and that leads to a range of experiences for pupils. And I think what we're trying to do is guarantee every pupil in the world, or certainly every pupil in the country, the same high quality experience through the same trajectory. And I think there's perhaps something to be done there. I mean, imagine an English national curriculum version of learning trajectories. Now it doesn't need to be a document, but it's actually here, English pupils from 0 to 7. Here's what their journey looks like. It's interesting that Clemens and Sarama typically work within that 0 to 7 framework. So you're almost, that's everything up until you're finished key stage 1, and then perhaps a little bit more. So that's how it's just worked out really well. That ties everything together, because I'm totally on board with your lists. But I think if we want to have a phonics for maths we probably need to give equal weighting to the vehicle and the way that those ideas are described and presented to teachers. And maybe that'll come in the CPD that's going to be available for early years teachers. But I think on your first day in the classroom, knowing about supervising, knowing about the principles of counting, knowing about the ways in which we can engage pupils, I think anyone who knows that one on the first day is at a massive advantage compared to their peers, and therefore their pupils are at a massive advantage relative to their peers in other classes.
Phonics famously has, or had, I should say at this point, letters and sounds, a document that was, and a sequence of teaching that was shared with teachers before I think a couple of years before I trained. And the point of that was to, make it clear to teachers what it is we're going to teach, what kind of order. Now, it was there are problematic elements to it, and it's since been superseded. But Kieran, you've spoken to this idea that perhaps this Phonics for Maths needs some kind of equivalent structure. I wonder, Neil, whether you agree with that, or if there's anything you want to add.
There is, I think, a fair few things out there already that can help teachers. I'm thinking particularly of our friend, the national strategies, which formed a lot of, that birth to 5 stuff within those national strategies forms a lot of the early years stuff that happens now. And there are some, really high quality bits of advice in there for teachers. Likewise, the old national strategies for Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 had a dedicated part for mental arithmetic. I remember that's why I found out this wonderful thing called the empty number line, which was such a fantastic tool for me to use. What do you mean I don't have to have, I can make the jumps wherever I want them to be, etc., etc. But as I say, I think these things are all archived now and they're quite tricky to find. I think having something like this, would be really useful for teachers to understand. And I do need to give them a little shout out, but Claire at Number Sense has done a sort of almost fantastic job at trying to almost imagine what this might look like, and has developed what I think is a really strong phonics, what we might conceive as Phonics for Maths program out there that starts from the early years through to Key Stage 1 and looks at a lot of the things that we have spoken about. So if would I love for the government to come out and produce another sort of free letters and sounds? Absolutely. But I'm really glad Claire's done the work that Claire and colleagues have done to kind of make Number Sense reality, because I think it's a really strong piece of work that does a lot of what letters and sounds did. So it's like the reverse, whereas letters and sounds have now been taken by people and kind of made into various different products. What I hope is that the Labour government go to Claire at Number Sense and go, this is really, really good. Almost, can we buy you out? So that Claire can retire, and then the government can just give it away for free.
I mean, equally, if they want to buy my number one intervention, they can buy me out, a couple of million quid. I'll be absolutely happy, and we'll still keep making the podcast. Promise. I think what you said there, Neil, is really, really important. I think if we look at how the implementation of this validation process has gone over the last 10 years, I know, Chris, you've spoken many times to me about this, is the idea that actually government created free to schools, certainly free at the point of access, resource. That should be the only consideration, because we have the expertise across the profession. And why shouldn't we then go, and if we're going to say here are the things that are important, well, let's make it so that everyone has parity of experience with that. Because if it becomes a market conditions experiment again, then I think schools end up paying over the odds for something that they don't necessarily need to. So, from that aspect, I'd be quite wary. But the more, having read the sort of biography of Boris Johnson, who was prime minister quite a lot of at points when key decisions could have been made, having he was, my interpretation is he was always afraid to let people down. And what he would say to one person would be different to another person because he didn't like giving people bad news, etc. And I think we don't have a national textbook in mathematics, and we don't have one standard phonics thing because of his inability to say no to people. Maybe that's a fair misinterpretation, but I remember when we were doing the podcast and he was prime minister saying, he just won't go that extra step. We just need to go one step further and we've got this. And then everyone has the option to use this really high quality textbook that's nation sponsored. And he didn't. And reading lots of sort of the stuff that's come out since, it feels as if had we had a different prime minister in place, we may have had a different outcome. And so I think it's a very, very important decision because we can't have a million different versions of the Phonics of Maths that people then pay over the odds for, because I don't think that's a good use of taxpayer money or schools' money.
I'd be surprised if he was anywhere near the detail on that stuff or on anything related to his time in government. That doesn't seem to have been one of his suggested strengths. Just a very brief, something I want to kind of attach to some of the stuff we've been saying, because we've all, both in this episode and previously, talked about our love of Clements and Sarama. And at the same time, we've just talked about, the equivalent of a step-by-step curriculum. So it'd be kind of wrong of me to not, clarify a little bit of nuance here, in that I think they're quite clear on the idea that even though in, say, learning trajectories, they spell out like this might happen and then this might happen and then this might happen, these are not discrete stages. There are overlap between them. Kids might learn different bits in different orders. And that's the nature of all learning, isn't it? While there are advantages to us, that's us saying it's a really good idea for teachers to know that we're going to try this and then this and then this and then this and then this, there's also the professional response to using this stuff, where we recognize that kids don't necessarily learn it in that linear order and that we might need to be more flexible in what we're doing. So yeah, just something I wanted to kind of layer on top of what I'd already said, because I don't want to give people the impression that it's, you teach this and if kids haven't got it, too bad, we're moving on, because that's, not how this stuff works.
I mean, I don't think this is going to be the episode that convinces people to listen to the podcast. I reckon the Phonics of Maths, or whatever I decide to title it, is going to be one that people who already listen and already are aware of our interpretation of the work of Clements and Sarama are familiar with. But I think it is important to clarify. I mean, just before we move on, the idea of having this validated Ofsted focus and that structure, I think I've mentioned a few times, goes back to levers and the levers we can pull. Obviously, Chris, being an ambition, you'll be familiar with nudge theory and how we can nudge teachers towards sort of utilizing and focusing their attention in certain directions. And if we can learn from the multiplication check, the MTC, it doesn't have this. I think sensible schools use times tables rock stars, and they use it frequently. But there's no validation process. There's a bit of a muddy Ofsted aren't using this to hold you to account, but actually now they are situation, but you don't have the scores in time for it to be an actual effective diagnostic. So if we're going to learn lessons about this and phonics, well, phonics had all those things and seems to have driven standards upwards. The MTC doesn't have those things, and certainly doesn't have clarity on those things. And actually, from the looks of my interpretation of results, is that it's not really made that much of a difference, and things are pretty grim on the ground. I don't know, Neil, if you're got your foot to the ground or your ear to the ground, that contradicts that interpretation. But I look at those results and I think, oh my goodness, no wonder no one likes maths, because they don't know the fundamentals of maths. And so I think there may be a learning opportunity between what's in place for phonics and what's not in place for multiplication check. And is there something to learn here if we are going through a validation process and if we are including Ofsted? And I think being honest up front about how the results are going to be used might be a sensible starting point, because I felt lied to because I did all 3 pilots. And then the first year I did the real thing, I was like, this isn't how the data was supposed to be used. It's supposed to be diagnostic. I want to see the results. Being sensible, I knew what the results were already before they were given to us. But many teachers won't have had the opportunity to do that, So I think that's a really important thing for me, is that we learn from our mistakes and we're really, really crystal clear about how any data might be used.
And I feel like there's also something to be said in tying that all down to the reception baseline as well, in terms of that data just gets locked away. And there are some there are some fundamental mathematical concepts that are sort of looked at within that reception baseline, which, as you say, I think they get locked away for literally, I think, 7 years, and that's what somehow some statistician somewhere is magically going to decide how much progress a child's made from being able to count out 3 bears through to doing 3/5 plus 8/5. I mean, let's take that besides the point. But yeah, there are definitely some interesting learnings as to what would happen, what would have to happen if some sort of check was put in place, what we could learn from the phonics. I think I'd much rather it look more like the phonics screening check than the current MTC does, bar perhaps and even then I'm not kind of convinced now as to how much I want. Originally I was like, yeah, they can do it on a tablet, it'll be pretty quick and easy, but at the end of year 1, maybe year 2, whenever we want to do this, is the dexterity really there for it to be a reliable thing? I'm not too sure. So a quick little bit of paper and pen would probably be absolutely fine for that. So it's an interesting question. I say I would be happy to see this used not as I don't think as a tool to beat schools with at all, but as I say, as a real sort of semi-diagnostic sense. I think having that separation between a screener and a diagnostic is pretty useful. I don't know how useful using the phonics screening check as a diagnostic assessment actually is, because it tests such a small amount of the code anyway. You might be able to pick up a few sort of trends, perhaps in terms of multi-syllabic words. You might be able to pick up a couple of trends in that, but I wouldn't use it as a core sort of diagnostic tool. But I think to give you an understanding of where kids are, and I think having a national sample attached to that, so that you can have an understanding of where your leaders can have an understanding of where your kids in Key Stage 1, year 1, year 2, whenever this hypothetical situation might play out. I think important to have. But yeah, one to definitely think about in a bit more detail as to what that one actually looks like.
I mean, there are 2 parts to that accountability, aren't there? In effect, if we think about phonics, basically you've got the phonics screening check, which an Ofsted inspector can discuss with the school as a way of saying, how, in summative terms, how's phonics going? And there's also we're going to talk to you about, we're going to look at phonics teaching, we're going to talk to you about your phonics teaching and crucial elements of it. And on the assumption that the Ofsted inspector in question knows their stuff about phonics, then those 2 things are a really useful part of the conversation about the quality of education in a school when it comes to the teaching of reading. And I would assume that something equivalent in what we are describing as a key area of teaching of mathematics could be useful. But again, it depends on both of those things being in place. It depends on there being a useful summative check, and it depends on Ofsted inspectors having the expertise or close to it to productively discuss and recognise the teaching of this stuff in schools in the first place.
I think if we did have something in place, it would need to be low maintenance for both teachers and pupils. I mean, it's almost a circle that can't be squared or a square that can't be circled. Could we use artificial intelligence? I don't know, because I've definitely seen people, remember the other thing, I don't want to maybe say names, but you take photographs and the parents are able to see all the wonderful things their pupils doing in reception. I mean, could we Could we, if we were taking photographs and then we give it to artificial intelligence and it's summarized what they thought of the pupils' attainment in mathematics or their competency in mathematics, But I also know that lots of teachers who use those kinds of software complained about how laborious it was, and typically the ability to take photographs is never as simple as it is on your own, just on your phone. And obviously, you don't use your own phone in the classroom. And so, yeah, I don't know. Is the long and short of it. Because I'm thinking about, are the delivery issues so great, considering we're talking about children so young, that actually, if we've got the stuff in place that allows us to focus teacher attention, focus pupil attention on those fundamentals, do we just trust that performance in year 3 is indicative that things have gone well, and then performance in year 6 or achievement in year 6 is such that actually you can see that things have gone well. But that's not something we do well as an education system, and perhaps not any education system does well. We don't trust that the fruit of our labors will pay off in 4 or 5 years' time. So yeah, so it's interesting. I think there are lessons to be learned, but what does that mean for teachers in the classroom? What does that mean for schools? We don't need to wait on the government to focus our attention on those things. Like we said, the things already exist. We can be systematic, and it's really about what's important, what behaviors will lead us to where we want to, and at the least effort for teachers, and if we can provide them with the information necessary, I think that goes a long way. So I think we've almost preempted question 5, Chris, on the phonics screening check, but it felt like Neil was sort of angling towards that, and so I thought, well, actually, all I've got to say is that, maybe just trust the process, and we'll, it'll all be okay. But it'd be worth doing a really good analysis of the MTC and the phonics check to see what the real differences are, because obviously we can only speak to our experience.
How long has the multiplication table check been in place?
I think last year was the 3rd official year.
Yeah.
Are we seeing, I've not been paying attention to the results of that. Are we seeing any kind of gentle increase in scores? Because I'm thinking back to the introduction of the phonics screening check and I was about to say precipitous, but it's kind of the reverse of that, the steep improvement over the 4 or 5 years subsequent to its introduction that we saw in decoding scores. Now, obviously, part of that has to be taken with a pinch of salt because of people getting used to the test and potential subconscious manipulation of results. But there was enough there to suggest that, well, actually, maybe we are starting to see an impact on decoding abilities as a consequence of this. Are we seeing anything equivalent to that with regards to the MTC, or is it too early to know?
I don't think it's moved much. I'm just looking at 22, 23, because they don't give you too much. So the average attainment score was 20 out of 25 in 22, 23. And in the year before that, the average attainment score was 19. So I appreciate that's only a year's difference. What that would be for 23, 24, I'm not sure.
I was going to say, because the test itself is out of 25, if the average is already 20, there's so little room in there to show improvement. One of the reasons why the phonics screening check was able to, why we were able to see that improvement over the space of 3 or 4 years is because you were getting, there was like a clear, is there a clear pass mark with the MTC? Because I think originally the pass mark for year 1 decoding assessment, the phonics screening check, was somewhere in the kind of 40s and 50s, and then it moved up to the kind of low 80s over the space of 3 or 4 years. So we were able to see that movement because there was already, because 40% of people of children weren't reaching a pass mark, we were able to see that incline more clearly. But I don't think there is a pass mark in inverted commas, is there?
No, there's not officially, but no. 25. You should be getting, if you know your times tables, you get 25. And that's the number I think we need to see, because the average score, high performing areas really pulled up the average score. Because I remember my local authority, 17. was the average in the first official year, so if 19, so that's a 2 mark difference. I mean, I always felt that if you were able to score 17, 18 at the start of year 4, then you would naturally know all your time, be able to score 25 by the time the check came around. So in my mind, if you're scoring 17, 18, you're probably about a year behind where you need to be. I don't know how accurate this is, but the way it's set up is that you've got 25% from the 2 5s and 10s, and then 75% of the questions come from the more difficult, maybe not the 11s, but certainly the more difficult sort of times tables. And so it's if those 5 marks are probably coming from a substantial set of the available times tables they could ask. So my interpretation of that is that actually there's a big gulf there, a substantial amount of learning that needs to take place, because you're only getting asked 25 out of many, many questions. So it'd be interesting to see the numbers, the percentage of pupils getting 25. But from my recollection, it was extremely low in the first year, and it hasn't really risen much since then.
It's so the data for this academic year is going to be released in November, but in 22-23 it was 29% of pupils scored 25, and that was an increase of just under 3% from high. I think it was that 26.9 or something like that, or 26.1. So 2% increase in full marks and a 0.4% increase on the average attainment score to 20, from around 20 points to however they, through statistics and averaging. So last year the average score was 20. The year before that, average score was 19. So not massive increases in a year, I wouldn't have thought. Bearing in mind that 1%, this is 1% of the whole year 4 cohort up and down the country in England. So,
I mean, on the plus side, I mean, I'm no maths expert, but if we've gone from 19 as the average to 20 as the average in a year, we're only 6 or 7 years before we've got kids getting 27 out of 25, and wow. When that happens, we're in a good place. Yeah. Sorry, couldn't resist.
No, absolutely. I mean, I was going to make an Omicron joke about if you want to see that exponential rise, you're going to need an Omicron variant of the multiplication.
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting to see what happens in November and see what the movement on this is. I would imagine it go up. Obviously, you would have had COVID and stuff like that, so you still got some COVID years coming through, just about. I'd probably say that next year is probably the last year where COVID will probably have a meaningful impact on these results. So, yeah, interesting times ahead.
Well, I reckon, unless I'm mistaken, that's basically all of the questions I had planned. So I'm more than happy to hand back over to you, Kieran, for final wisdom.
You don't want to round it off yourself, Chris?
Oh, I mean, I could try, but I'd probably do a terrible job. I'll give it a go, and then then you do it properly. So I feel like we've covered a lot of bases there in terms of understanding the phonics of maths, understanding the analogy between it and phonics related to reading, what it might entail, how it might be implemented, and accountability structures that might support it. I'm not going to do all that's left to say though, because I can't possibly do that. No. You round it off, Kieran. I wouldn't know how to begin.
Do you think we hit the brief, Chris? Whenever, in terms of we're starting to have a pretty long conversation about what this episode would entail. Do you reckon we've hit the brief?
Yeah, I think any teacher or school leader coming into this who wants to know a bit more about what might be meant by the phonics of maths, what this might mean for the Labour government's curriculum and assessment review, etc. I like to think that they'll be coming away from this with a significantly better understanding than they had before. So, yeah, I think we've done okay.
Fantastic job done then. Yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed it. I think it's something worth keeping an eye on, worth thinking about. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.